Thank you, Radio Uganda. This is your host, Robert Ogwal, with your program for this week's Let's Face It. Good afternoon, United States of America. Good evening, London. And good evening, Africa. And some parts of Asia, I would say good morning. Welcome to Let's Face It. Fellow countrymen, as I said last week, the time is ticking. And time waits for no man. And we know that we have a destiny. As I have said before, I have been to the mountaintop. I have seen the future, and the future is good. And I know that our hour has come. But as the hour comes, anxiety also kind of squeezes in. People are so anxious. But I will start with the Word of God. For now, it is only through the power of God that we can be able to overcome our adversaries. Isaiah 10:1-2, woe to those who decree unjust statutes, and to those who continually record unjust decisions, to deprive the needy of justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their rights. Oh, Uganda. George Washington once said, government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is a force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. I repeat, George Washington said, government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is a force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. We all know what our people have gone through. We all know the countdown to what has been described or supposedly supposed to be an election. The countdown has begun. Today I am going to be talking about states. Last week I spoke about what is politics and how people live off politics. But today I'm going to talk about nation states. Why am I talking about nation states? As I've advocated before, our anxieties about change, meaningful change, has driven me to discuss or to make reference in terms of what states are and why we have been unable to attain what we call a nation state. Fellow countrymen, I will quickly run through the recent events in Kampala before I bring in the issue of the nation states to put us at ease. We have seen Mbabazi's declaration and all the sentiments. Somebody actually called me today very excited. And I said, do not be excited. We have not crossed the River Jordan yet. For the man we are dealing with in Uganda is a very deceptive man. Richard Dowden once said in his articles, African Arguments, that even if you got Muhoozi or got Janet Museveni or Mbabazi, you will have just got more Museveni. Museveni is clever. He's another Putin. Putin left and came back again. And that is not meaningful change. There was also an article on Monitor yesterday, fellow countrymen, that Sejusa had been arrested. Fellow countrymen, in intelligence and national security, governments use what they call brinkmanship, which is testing the waters to see who will buckle fast. Do not be excited. If you go on YouTube, you will notice that while Sejusa was being followed or supposedly arrested, he made one phone call and entered into the police station. And hours later, even within hours, he had been released. Sejusa has got documents, not actually documents, he has got voice recordings which is used to blackmail Museveni, and he's threatening, he's blackmailing him to a point saying, if you dare, I will do this. So Museveni's government will try to test the waters, but they will not go further than that. Mbama Mbabazi also was a security minister, and he will not play games. He will know where to, how far he can go. Fellow countrymen, if you notice something he says is unopposed, let us take that not only with a pinch of salt, but let's take the whole salt with it, because we know the man we are dealing with is very deceptive. And as far as we are concerned, it's a military state. And military states do not transist to democracies merely because of people power. The whole military establishment has to come down. Fellow countrymen, I thank you for listening. I'm going to talk about the nation state on this program, on today's Let's Face It. Why the nation state? We have never been a nation, neither as our state represents the nation. I will rewind your minds to 1950s during the anti-colonial or independence struggles. It all began in Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah taking over taking the instruments of power from the British colonizers. But fellow countrymen, something happened that kind of speeded up the entire decolonization. Kwame Nkrumah's government tended to lean towards the Soviet Union. And if you remember, it was just the end of the Cold War. And Britain's economy, or the British Empire, its economy came from its colonies and most of the other colonizers, which meant there was a new type of colonial, power struggle in the West, and they needed to maintain their resources from the colonial colonies, even if they were getting independence. And as such, they created a new organization, a new body called the Commonwealth, where we were supposed to bank all our proceeds to the UK. But something also happened. That meant they had to speed up decolonization, lest we turn to the Soviet Union to free us of our colonial masters. And that meant there was a speedy process of decolonization. Countries or kingdoms and tribes and ethnic groups that were brought together by force were suddenly brought under a new system which had to be kept by force. And as such, we had passed through a pre-national state to a military state or tribal states. That's why we must discuss this today, lest we get overexcited about the going of Museveni and yet find ourselves in still a tribal or military state. As the previous program said, they insinuated we must be sure what are we going to present to Ugandans. It happened in 1979. After the Liberation War, we found ourselves in another military state. Let's face it, all through history, no military state has ever been or transited to a constitutional state or a nation state without the dismantling of the military. Because power is in the gun, fellow countrymen. Idi Amin's military state had to be brought down by the liberators supported by Tanzanian troops. Obote's also fell because of the same. Tito's and even Museveni's will have to fall that way. Let's face it, whether we like it or not. But the most important thing is the vanguard of whatever force comes up to overthrow or to remove Museveni must be committed to resisting militarism, and then only then will we be able to transit to a developmental state or a constitutional state. Fellow countrymen, we are at a critical juncture in our life and also in the future of our countries. I say this because a state is a territorial political community for which there is an independent organized government. A nation state is a state whose primary loyalty is to a culture self-identity. We don't have one culture in Uganda, which we can call a nation or a nationality, or one language, if you look at Kenya and Tanzania, Swahili. And in this case, we can't call ourselves a nation or nationality. And because of this, and as such, the predominant form of state organization, therefore, is nulled, only put together by the military. Nation states possesses sovereignty and legitimacy. The significance of the nation state is that once consolidated around a particular nationality, it is a stable form of state organization. It is a sole form in which the growth of democracy is possible and which does not have a tendency to expand its territory. This stable environment proved to be essential from the emergence of the modern financial, industrial, and technological civilizations in Western Europe in the 17th and the 18th centuries. The only historic competitors were Imperial China, which was technologically highly innovative but did not become an industrial society until modern times, and the early Islamic Salafites, which was also technologically and culturally innovative but was conquered by military and tribal states. Fellow countrymen, we know we are tribal states brought together. We cannot hide from that. But if you look at Europe, until nation states appeared in the 16th and the 17th centuries, government was by rulers whose authority did not derive from the people whom they ruled. And that's why they were termed subjects. States ruled in that way had 7 different forms: personal rule, theocracy, city-states, oligarchy, and military states, tribal state, and empire. The principal function of such a ruler was to achieve peace and order by judging disputes and enacting laws by which disputes would be avoided. This could only be performed if he, rarely she, there were not really many women at that time in that kind of leadership, his authority was not derived from his subjects. And to reinforce that authority, the concept of legitimacy arose, which defined the right to rule independently, yes, independently, from any other influences. And to reinforce that authority, they made decisions independent of any constitutional system. Legitimacy had to be certain in order to be effective. And a disputed legitimacy was undesirable and might give rise to civil war. That is why we are discussing these issues. Personal rule was the usual first form of state organizations, almost always realized by some kind of hereditary dynasty. It was generally supported by religious section, historically the normal sources of morality, They involved when theocracy arose. You find, like in Uganda, we had issues in the 60s with Catholics, Protestants being associated with certain particular parties. But, fellow countrymen, most of these systems declined when they were attacked or conquered by military and tribal states because they were unsustainable. We all know our situation in Uganda because of the personal nature of rule we have in Uganda today. Personal rule does not account. It does not need constitutionalism. In Europe, even these things happened. City-states arose in Europe also when personal rule was weak in order to exploit that added value obtainable by trade. Both the added value from trade and industry was also available to states. The only form of wealth was the surplus obtained from agriculture. Personal states, therefore, had an inherent tendency to seek to extend their territories. If you remember, in Uganda, we were already expanding our territories to Rwanda and Congo, and even to Sudan, fellow countrymen, by conquest, by inheritance or other means. And in this way, territorial empires arose. Saddam Hussein tried to also increase his territory by taking Kuwait. In some states, the army gained control of its own recruitment and promotion and set up independent military juntas or castles, which we call military rule. In some states, when pastoral tribes established a form of tribal government, also generally supported by religious sanctions or sections, almost the core, although the core of most territorial empires were personal states, they also had been, they had a bit of theocracies. City-states also emerged, military states and tribal states out of all this. And as such, pre-national forms of government were inconsistent, and I repeat, were and continue to remain inconsistent with constitutional rule. That is why we have a problem in Uganda. That is why we've continued to have problems in Uganda, because of these personal rules or states. The establishment of a nation state entailed the transfer of legitimacy from a ruler not accountable to those that he ruled before. Why? If you look at Uganda's history, we had a situation where after independence, it was hurriedly done, and Buganda made a pact with UPC and transisted that power to Milton Obote's first government. That was very crucial in our politics. The establishment of a nation state entails the transfer of legitimacy from a ruler not accountable to those he ruled, or to one accountable to a nation. This arises as the development of wealth from improved agricultural, trade, and all kinds of things. The civil societies also seek communal identity through language, religion, and common social organizations, and shared experiences and interests. Now, we also have a shared experience and interest, but we have not yet become a nation. We can identify with three phases in the development of each state. Phase one was the development of a national identity within a clearly defined pre-national state. But in our case, our independence struggle was not long enough for us to kind of form an identity as a people. It was not even 1 year and we were given independence because of what happened in Ghana and Congo, who were rushed to, they granted us independence so quickly and we did not form a national identity. There is a second phase, which is the transfer of legitimacy from the ruler to the nation, which was done in 1962 when Obote and the Kabaka discussed the way forward. In a book written by an Englishman, Kenneth Ingham, I make reference that Obote was summoned to the Kabaka's office after DP actually won, before DP won. And they spent the whole night forging that kind of union. But by morning, they had agreed to some kind of collision. That was when they decided that the president would be the Kabaka and Obote would be the prime minister. It was this phase 2 that brought inclusive peace and the transfer of that legitimacy from the Kabaka to the nation. By some form of rebellion against the ruler or an assertion of nationality. But this was not through violence. This was an agreed arrangement. Phase 3 is the expression of that legitimacy by a legal process called a constitution, under which the government can be appointed and removed. Its powers can be debated and approved, and both the government and the private litigation are subject to law, which we don't have in Uganda, which also failed after the 1966 crisis when the constitution was abrogated. And above, and both the government and private litigation are subject to the same law. Most present states have made the transition to phase 2. And of these, an increasing number, perhaps a majority, have made a further transition to phase 3. We are still stuck on phase 1 because in Uganda, the man who rules today, something happened. He crafted the notion of pretending to be a civilian government led by the military, or if you like, a military government led by the civilians. It's the same thing. Each of these phases can be identified to a particular debatable event in each nation state. As I have also emphasized, 1962, 1964 also is a phase of the military mutiny. 1966 crisis also identifies with this particular transition. Each phase has to be overcome or has to overcome potential obstacles. Sometimes painfully, in many countries, the realization of these phases require several attempts, so that it is only in hindsight that we can be sure that a particular phase has been passed, or we have gone through a certain particular phase, and now we are in a second phase. It is impossible, fellow countrymen, to be able to proceed without these painful events which history and scholars have so much identified. We know the phase we are in now, fellow countrymen. Let's face it. We have transited from pre-national state to phase 1 constitutional crisis after the 1966 crisis, but at the same time, constitutional faded away when militarism came in. National accountability may be resisted, not only by rulers, but also by interest groups whose special privileges which had been negotiated by the ruler may be compromised. Traditional institutions may fail in their responsibilities to the nation. Civil societies may be insignificantly, or if I may use insufficient, to influence or represent the whole nation. So the state remains hanging in a balance. State institutions are captured by one and more minority elites who contend with each one for supremacy. This is what has been happening when the Acholis, the Basilios were under the Langis, or the Langis and the Cholis had that fragmentation just before 1985. Minorities and institutions, they start to shift for power, clamber for the same power. The same minority elites may then compromise with each other to the exclusion of other interests, like the Banyankole and the Bachiga and the Westerners right now, for the exclusion of others' interests. Our interest does not matter, or power may be handed over to the military, which sets up a military ruler to perform the functions that personal rule has failed to do. That is why Museveni, at 1 minute, sometimes is wearing a suit, the next day is wearing a military uniform. It sets up a military ruler to perform the functions that his personal rulers failed. When a state is very weak, a theocratic faction may seek to seize power in the name of its religion or some kind of other order, or an imperial faction may pose the dream of a supernatural hegemony. However, provided the social and economic development continues, civil society eventually becomes strong enough to establish a stable and effective constitution. We have seen this happening in Uganda, in the sense that we have a civil society in Kampala trying to bring down this government. But the civil society is not nationwide, is not strong enough. It does not extend to the north because development is concentrated within Kampala. Fellow countrymen, we know we have a military state and not a nation state. We know that there is no state, no military state or personal state, if I may use in this case where it's a combination of two, has ever been has ever changed, transited to a developmental state, because it is strengthened by its military system. States that arise from territorial empires generally do so by means of national revolt, and so as to come into being with a sense of national identity. Although often unclear, there are states which are, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, were often creations of the imperial powers, and they had to construct a national identity within their powers, often from desperate social, tribal, or religious components. In the absence of a legitimate national government, they generally experience phases of military, personal, and all kinds of democratic, dictatorship. While a national sense developed, in few states this process has not yet occurred. When a significant national identity existed to support constitutional government, the transition may occur relatively peacefully. But our analysis examines first these ideas in greater depth, that the nature of various pre-national states, or then the natures of these our pre-national states, the three phases of the nation state, and the phases that are illustrated by the constitutional developments of individual countries, One is the nation state, which I have already spoken about. However, that nation state has got to have some loyalty to a cultural identity. We do not have that. A language, educational system, above all, the citizens of each of these nations have a general sense of what is to belong to it and what it requires of them. In the hurried state of getting us into independence, we did not have a long fight for independence, and as such, we were unable to forge a national identity. As if you compare our system to Tanzania and Kenya, where Kenya, they had the Mau Mau rebellion, which helped forge some kind of unity, but it wasn't also long enough. In Kenya, but they had Swahili. In Tanzania, Tanzania actually was handed over, was a spoil of war that was given to Britain because it was initially or formerly a German colony. But there is something very interesting. Tribalism also occurred in most of these post-colonial states whose boundaries had been set by the 19th century treaties between European colonizing powers. Although the newly independent countries had the trappings of a nation state and spoke the language of our former colonizers, which was English, it compromised in reality of a number of tribes, often many which had been resident before colonization. The struggle against colonial rule, fellow countrymen, had not been long or fierce enough to create a single national identity, so that the principal loyalty was still to the tribe, not to the country. If you see what happened to UPC recently, that was a political monarchy. The kingdom of UPC wanted to retrieve its UPC from Acholi. They believed that UPC should belong to Obote's tribe. And yet there was a bossa there who stood, they didn't want anything to do with the bossa. Ruhangaranga at one time wanted the same. Even in DP, when Mao took over DP, there were all these ethnic tribal issues. That is the painful truth. And believe me not, the NRM is basically a Munyankole party. That's why the leadership is coming from within that. These tribal identities are there and we can't hide them. So the principal loyalty are still with the tribe, not the country. If you look further, a further incentive also is the lack of relationship between colonial borders and tribal boundaries, because tribes were often divided between states. In such circumstances, you get some Luos in Kenya, some Luos in Uganda, some Luos in Tanzania. You get a Luos some Alurs in Congo, and some in Uganda, some Lugwaras in Ugandan side and Madis in the other Congo side. Also in the western borders of Uganda, you get the Banyankole and all that crossing back and forth. That is a legacy of what we are in. In such circumstances, political parties usually have a tribal basis. In order to rule, therefore, the earlier governments of former colonies of a colony had to rely on only people whom it knew well enough to trust, namely members of their own tribes. The consequent temptation to favor these tribes over other tribes in the distribution of assets and offices was therefore so strong and sometimes not resisted, so that the government lost legitimacy among the excluded tribes. Fellow countrymen, let's face it, these problems and conflicts can be overcome when national loyalties prove stronger than tribal ones. National leaders emerge, when national leaders emerge who represent a national policy rather than a tribal identity. That is why we have not been able to pick up the gun against this regime. Because people are still dwelling on that notion. The new leaders, the new vanguard of our generation, we are young people. We are young people with a dream of 50 years, not of only tomorrow. We do not see our own tribes. We have been to the past and we know where the future is. This new vanguard of this liberation front should be able, not only should, must resist these tribal sentiments. Because the concept of a tribal society is sometimes applied to states divided communally. For example, you look at in Northern Ireland, there was Catholics and Protestants. In between the Kurds and the Arabs, the Christians and Islamic sects in Syria, in Iraq and Yemen. These terms, these are there. We cannot divide it. In a tribal state, the primary loyalty is to the tribe. Prove me. How do we test this concept? Every time a government has been removed from Uganda, to prove it has been a military state, the military establishment or the leadership goes to exile or is completely dismantled. And they start to build the army from zero. It happened in 1971. Even prior to 1971, after the 1964 military mutiny in Uganda, something happened. Most of the mutineers were expelled from the army. Also, the army commander at the time, Opolot, Shaban Opolot, was closer to the Kabaka. And he also married, he married somebody from the Kabaka's family, which created a bigger cleavage between him and Obote. And Obote started to rely more on Idi Amin, who also had links. The defense minister, Onama, was also married to one of Obote's sisters. But soon after, a new position was created for Onama, Chief of Defense Staff, which actually meant he did not have power, administrative power. It was merely ceremonial. And Amin was given most of the power. When Amin came to power, most of Obote's men fled to exile. And he replaced most of his top-ranking men with men from West Nile. When he was overthrown, when the UNLA came back to power, most of the top guard of the military were again from the north. When Obote was overthrown, the same issue happened with the Tito de Basilio regime. When it also collapsed, all the forces in there also left, and Museveni had to come in with his army. This also applies to this very system. We are a military state, and all through history, no military state, Iraq, Libya, Egypt, has ever been dismantled and transited to a constitutional or democratic government without military force. But, mark my words, fellow countrymen, it is important to have a balance between the civil society and the military, because the military has a tendency to to upsurge power. That is why South Africa managed to transit to a democratic constitutional system. Umkuhonti Wisizwi, this military wing, in conjunction with the civil disobedience in South Africa, had reached a stalemate. And the power of South Africa was caught between these two fires. And as such, in Uganda, as my predecessor, the program before was saying, why can't we have the same issue in the same Burundian spirit in Uganda? It is only the Spirit of God that can empower people. The Spirit which the Bible says that in those days I will pour my Spirit upon all flesh. And when God uses the people, he uses anything. The people of Uganda may have been subdued by Museveni wearing military uniforms and showing all kinds of military power. If you see recently, a balloon was bought for 500 million to carry a camera up to threaten the population. But 500 million for a balloon, most of the money probably went to one of the psychophants. It is only posturing. A few months ago, they marched through Kampala with all kinds of gadgets. I call them the Kaihura force, to subdue the people. In 2007, jet fighters flew over Makerere University, and people scrambled to safety thinking it was going to crash, but he was merely showing his power. This is a military government, fellow countrymen. And it has to be brought down in conjunction with the people on the ground. If it is only an external military force, we will replace this system with another military. Besigye and the rest of the opposition in Uganda, when they coined the walk to work, the walk to work was one of the best plans they ever came up with. It did not have a political kind of connotation on it. It merely talked about the grievances of the people. And everybody walked. And they came down at them with such force because they said it is illegal to walk. Fellow countrymen, it is illegal to walk. Now, let there be stay at home, and this government will collapse. Let them stay at home for 3-4 days, and let Kaihura walk the streets alone, in conjunction with a military force. And it has started to happen, fellow countrymen. It is amazing how history repeats itself. In the 60s, there was a problem in the UPC when the Americans had an eye on Gracie Bingira because he was a capitalist. They did not like John Kakonge because he was a communist. And both men were veering for, or were Secretary General of UPC. The same thing has happened now. But what it means, there is a split in the system. If it is by default or by design, or it's a trick by the system, I don't know. But I know one thing for sure, that the power that Museveni used to possess in keeping one army and controlling everybody is no longer sustainable. But this transition has been seen several times in most in most dictatorships. In Romania, there was a man called Nicolae Ceausescu. He was also deposed by the military. Mussolini, even Germany. Gaddafi, I think Museveni is dreaming of Gaddafi now, when he finally saw him lying on a sponge mattress. And Iraq. Most of these systems start to fragment from themselves, from within. But those who carry or who have helped the system, they tend to try to transist, to align with new systems or new voices in order to pave or carve a position for themselves in what is to come. And that is why you see people like Sejusa, Amama Mbabazi, and so forth calling on changes. But they have been part and parcel of it. Most dictators or most military states, fellow countrymen, do not pack up and go. Museveni cannot pack up and go. The crimes and the evil that has been committed will not allow him to. It is a military state, it's not a constitutional state. Whether you say it is a civilian government led by the military or a military government led by civilians, you arrive at the same point. Look at most of the ministers, Major General Jim Muhezi, Major General Otafire, all of it is the militarization of our of institutions which are supposed to actually be led by civilians. We have never had a neutral force. And until that time when we have a neutral force that comes in and its job is to play a neutral role, we will continue to have such problems. Democracy cannot germinate out of a system which is not neutral. Let's face it, the time is ticking. No one can stop the time. We have no fear for Museveni's jet fighters, for his army men. The time when it comes, he's going to have to bow down. But my biggest question is, are we able to subdue the new force to allow constitutionalism, given the fact that we are a tribal nation, we are a tribal state? Yes, there is no fear. We are tribes, fine. But our history has showed us that unless the state is free from tribal sentiments, it's not sustainable. It begins to be a problem when government or governance delivers the political goods with tribalistic sentiments. But if we can deliver political goods minus politics, then we have arrived, fellow countrymen. These political goods include justice, security, all sorts of services minus politics. The issue of Uganda also has got to be addressed. Give Mengo, let Mengo deal with its own issues. Fellow countrymen, I know we have reached the River Jordan. And everybody is wondering where the guns are going to come from. When it started in Libya, it started from a revolt from within. And men and young men and women who live in the UK boarded flights and went and joined the struggle. Gaddafi himself kept appearing on TV, saying revolutionaries don't retire. He ended up retiring on a mattress. Fellow countrymen, we serve a living God. And I prophesy to you today, as I did before, that the Musevenis that you see today, you will see no more tomorrow. For the Lord your God will fight for you. The Lord has heard the cry of his people. And I know that God will give us and bring this change as long as we are not going to abuse that gift. When God brings power, or when God gives you brings change, it must be for everybody, not for selfish ends. I know that the North feels that they have been recipients of this regime for the last 29 years. But that does not mean we should return and be exempt, or rather subdue others. Neither does the South. For the first time in our history, every time Museveni does something, he brings more people towards this cause. But the cause itself is not enough. We must have the courage to resist what I call political sentiments or emotional politics of our past. The man who created DP, Bentiu Anokaya, is long dead. The founder of UPC is long dead. Both of them, Masagazi and Obote. They are long gone. And here we, our generation, are still licking the wounds and paying the price of nationhood. We were quickly brought together as a nation. We were actually dropped as a nation. You are Ugandans. Yes, the consequences of our past has troubled us for the last 40 years. We have been in the political wilderness for 40 years. But that does not mean we should not have the courage to organize ourselves within our own concepts, to build our own kind of democracy called Afrocracy. Afrocracy from within our own, not based on the Western concepts. Fellow countrymen, let's face it. Are you ready? Yes, we are ready. And I know for sure that the time has come. But we must be prepared to be courageous, because change is painful. And when change comes, it's painfully sweet. It is like a mother who goes into labor. 9 months she's carried a baby in her womb, and when she gives birth it's painful, but once it's done she holds her bundle of joy with glee and happiness. 40 years in the political wilderness, never has a cause united Ugandans so much. Those in power are trying to create a new system to pass on to protect their own. No, we are not fools. Not even Kaiura's guns or tear gas can stop this change. But just one spark will set it off. Are you prepared? Are you prepared to go home? Are you prepared to be part of this change? Yes, you better be prepared, for change has come. If you do not accept this change, it might catch you off guard and change you. Be prepared for the change, and let's change Uganda for the better for all of us. We know our history and we know where we are going. Our constitution should be written by our history, not our emotions and not our sentiments. The politics of contestation cannot work in Africa. Let us use politics of consensus, where we talk, even if we have to talk for 20 years. But in the end, fellow countrymen, the pearl of Africa shall rise and shine again. I thank you. May the Spirit of the Lord be upon you and give you strength as we march down towards Kampala to bring hope to our people. What our fathers and our forefathers failed to do, this generation shall see and shall establish that generations and generations shall marvel and shall uphold it. For the future of Uganda is now. It's not tomorrow, not yesterday. Let us have the courage to deal with our country and face it. I thank you for listening. This is your host, Robert Ogwal, in Let's Face It. Until next weekend, may God bless you and see you in Chadondo or Kampala sooner than we have expected. Thank you for listening.
As I look around me, I see the world in a different light. Everything is changing, and it happened overnight. Changing for the better, and it starts with you and me. So we'll sing our song together, and forever we'll be free. Sing a song of freedom, everyone join in. People come together, everybody sing. Sing a song of freedom, each and every man. People come together all across the land. If you're looking for an answer, it's very close at hand. Just take a look around you, and then you'll understand. Clap your hands together and let me hear the sound. It's the time for liberation, so pass the